Good afternoon. Welcome to the Faculty of Information. I'm Andrew Clement, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce Tom Drake, NSA whistleblower, who's going to talk to us about secret NSA CSEC surveillance versus democracy. Surveillance has been very much in the news these days. We've been treated to weekly front-page revelations about state surveillance, certainly a challenge to our notions of privacy, but it also challenges us in terms of our notions of democracy. We've seen secret agents, secret agencies operate beyond the law, in secret. They intimidate those who question them. They mislead and cow our legislators. They operate behind a veil in which those who expose what they do can have their lives turned upside down. The little we know about these surveillance agencies comes not through our usual institutions of democratic oversight, but because of a few very brave whistleblowers who've worked on the inside and have not been able to tolerate what they see and have, at great personal risk, exposed the information to let us, the public, be much better informed in ways that we have a right to. Obviously, most recently, we have Edward Snowden's example, who provides almost weekly headlines around the world about these shocking revelations of the NSA and other state security agencies and how they are looking into our digital lives. But Snowden is only the latest, the most prominent, but only the latest of a series of whistleblowers who since 2001, or more precisely, I guess 2005, have been telling us in the best ways that they can what's going on inside the NSA, the National Security Agency. And his example has built on what he's learned, what Snowden has learned from the previous whistleblowers. In particular, from our guest today, Tom Drake, who joined the NSA. First day of work was September 1st, 2011, and then very soon after that became disturbed by what he saw in terms of the waste, the fraud, the violations of constitutional and legal norms, and he resigned in 2008. Shortly thereafter, he was charged with 10 felony counts, including 5 under the Espionage Act, with penalties up to 35 years in prison. But on the eve of his trial, all those charges were dropped, and since then he has been a free person and has devoted his life to helping us become more aware of what's going on in these agencies. His timing in being able to come here is particularly fortunate for us in Canada. Canadian security agencies, in particular the Communications Security Establishment Canada, has only relatively recently popped up in these Snowden revelations. And even last week, when we heard that the CSEC was facilitating the NSA's spying on the G20 in 2010, within view of us here, all that the government officials have been saying is that we don't target Canadians and we follow the law, but beyond that we have no better idea publicly of what's going on. So Thomas Drake has been, through his NSA experience, has got some things to say about CSEC, which I think we look forward to. It's also fortuitous that he's here on campus at this time. our administration is proposing to outsource faculty and staff email to Microsoft Office 365, which will be hosted in the US and servers around the world. And Microsoft is known from these revelations as one of the 9 corporations that have been in partnership with the NSA through the PRISM program. In fact, Microsoft was the first. A couple of weeks ago, we organized a teach-in here where a number of speakers talked about the implications from various perspectives of that outsourcing. But Tom Drake, who I tried to get, wasn't able to come at that time. So I'm really delighted that he's been able to come now. So he has a lot to say. He's going to talk for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then there will be an extended question and answer period. I'll give people a chance at 2 o'clock to leave gracefully, but if you want to stay on beyond that, Tom is very happy to talk to you. So without further ado, please welcome Tom Drake.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a real honor to be here. I didn't know that Toronto was going to be so public of late between your mayor and certain G8 and G20 summits that have occurred in the past. But some of us are following Toronto news with some interest of late. We used to have a mayor in Washington, D.C. that ran into similar difficulties some years ago. So. Getting here was quite interesting for me this morning, coming through customs, and I'm just going to say this here because it's important that any time additional questions are asked of you while you're coming into another country, either coming into the country or returning back into the States, it's important to publicize it. I actually considered that I probably would be questioned in some manner, given my background and where I used to work, and given the charges, the rather egregious charges that were levied against me by the government. So I just want to, up front, just give you a sense of what it means to be questioned by authorities at the border. I was actually asked what the purpose of my trip was, which is a standard question, but then the questions actually went a bit further than that, probing about the specific nature of my trip, where I was speaking, the subject matter that I was speaking about, which is surveillance, and what type of surveillance, which I said government, in reference to where I used to work. But then the question, I think, was the one that kind of crossed the line as far as I'm concerned. I was actually asked to produce an invitation letter to prove the purpose of my trip. Last time I checked, no visa is required for a U.S. citizen to come into Canada. All I need is my U.S. passport. I have been in other countries where, in fact, the equivalent of an invitation letter is required as part of the visa application process. And so I found it particularly disturbing that I would be asked for additional papers, I'm using that phrase on purpose, additional papers to prove the purpose of my visit beyond the fact that I had a passport. And I did not have an invitation letter from the University of Toronto, per se, a formal one. I did have my itinerary. That itinerary was examined from Professor Clementi, and that itinerary letter was actually examined in quite a bit of detail before I was cleared to go. There are any number of colleagues, including my own lawyer, who've actually been questioned at the border, returning from overseas, where they're actually detained in a separate room for additional, and all that does is send a very chilling message. It's intended to harass, it's intended to intimidate. And we've all agreed in my extended network that any time we are asked questions or we are detained beyond any normal protocol, transiting into or out of country and or returning to the United States, that we make it public as soon as possible, and so I'm doing that now. I do have a lot to say. There's an awful lot in the news. I've been reliving the past 12 years, the results of the explosive and extraordinary disclosures of Edward Snowden, who I consider a fellow NSA whistleblower. My intent is to use this as an opportunity to share with you what's at stake in terms of democracy and liberty, but also the backdrop, the context for it is my own personal ordeal. I think when you begin to see what I went through over a 5-year-plus period at the other end, the receiving end of the surveillance state in the United States, you gain a better appreciation for what truly is at stake. Because I've already lived the surveillance state, and I don't want anybody else to live it with me, and I don't want the future to be owned by a surveillance state. We are individuals, we're human beings, we have inalienable rights that makes us sovereign. But the first phrase I'm going to say is that apparently in the post-9/11 era, far beyond the purpose of going after legitimate threats to international stability, is that apparently national security, an extraordinarily overloaded phrase, is now the state religion in many democracies, including the United States and increasingly in Canada. That somehow, when you invoke the mantle, when you invoke the label of national security, you are exempt from all inquiries, you're exempt from all queries, you're exempt from oversight, and you do not question the high priest's secrecy. And we're in a very challenging space, a very difficult space, in terms of history, because history is not kind. We have many dark chapters in the 20th century alone, highlighting what happened in the Soviet Union, highlighting what happened in East Germany, highlighting what happened during the Nazi era, as well as any number of other dictatorships and tyrannical governments across this globe. We've had, democracy has progressed in terms of human history. I certainly don't want to see it regress. And that's why I continue to speak out and speak up and continue to speak truth to and of power. But I paid an extraordinarily high price for having done so. But I stand here as a free human being before you. And as the weeks and months go by since I did serve 1 year of probation and 1 year community service without jail time or fine, being free is more precious to me now than ever. I just want to have you consider, those who are here in the room as well as those who are watching via live streaming, what does it really mean to be free? Because ultimately that's what's at stake. And that somehow we have to give up freedoms and liberties for the sake of security. We had one of the founding fathers of the United States who actually said something about that. If you want to seek a little safety, for sake of security, you end up, or for the sake of security, you end up losing both, to paraphrase Benjamin Franklin. My ordeal at the hands of the government was quite extraordinary. I faced many decades in prison for what I did. I was convicted by the truth. And so the context here, I'm going to give you through the lens of my own experience, what's at stake for the United States and Canada. Most of my youth was actually, I grew up in Vermont. And because Vermont bordered Canada, we accepted most of the Canadian coins in the local stores and establishments. And so I always had very fond memories and knowledge by virtue of having lived right next to Canada while growing up in Vermont. And I always looked to the neighbor to the north as a very friendly neighbor, and I always looked to the neighbor to the north as two countries who shared the longest unguarded border in the world. 9/11 has changed a number of things in that regard. And there is a lot at stake. And so I do have a few slides as sort of as backdrop and context to establish what really is at stake. But I'm going to use a lens of my personal ordeal so you get to live in part what it's like to live on the receiving end of the surveillance state. And what happens when the government decides they're going to make you an enemy of the state and break you through various means, turn your life inside out and upside down. It's not pleasant. I'm extraordinarily fortunate. I'm extraordinarily fortunate that I'm here before you as a free human being. I cannot overemphasize that. There's any number of others who've been charged in this relentless, ruthless campaign in war against truth tellers and whistleblowers in the Obama administration, 8 to date, who've been charged like I was. I was the first on the Obama administration charged with espionage, only the second whistleblower in history. The first was Daniel Ellsberg, only the fourth in U.S. history to be charged as a non-spy for non-spy activities under the Espionage Act, an act that was actually passed in World War I, designed to go after actual spies and not whistleblowers. And it has been used routinely now by the Biden administration, or the threat to use it, against any number of other people, far more than what you've heard of publicly of those charged under that act, against those who dare question authority, dare question power, dare reveal government criminality and wrongdoing. It's an extremely dangerous environment to speak truth to enough power. But I could not be here standing in front of you free if it was not for the criminal defense attorneys. I ultimately was declared indigent before the court. I had run out of money through my private attorney. I could not stand before you free if it wasn't for my public defenders and for an extraordinary individual named Justin Radak, who defended me in the court of public opinion and was my voice when I had none. So, this is how I got started in the cyberspace, the digital era. My first home computer was an Atari 800. Anybody ever own an Atari 800? Ah, one hand is raised. I look back on the golden era of computing, what I call the 8-bit era of computing, the late 70s and 80s, as sort of the halcyon days, the innocent days, the days in which I remember when I first met up with the Chaos Computer Club in Germany during the 1980s, with acoustic modems, 300 baud modems, that you put down and you hear that modem sound, knowing when it made that connection, 300 baud, mind you. Who knew about wireless until much, much later? So those were the early days, but this was the time in which I was introduced to the digital world. This is where I learned how to program. I was in the military. I was flying in RC-135s. As a cryptolinguist, the target country in which I became an expert was East Germany. I never imagined that the template of the Stasi, their motto to know everything, would be the playbook for state-sponsored surveillance on an extraordinary scale by the United States government and in partnership with other countries like the United Kingdom, like Canada's security services, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and well as a number of other countries. Never imagined. Just never imagined. And here's why. I grew up as a very young teenager in the 1970s. And in U.S. history, it was a very tumultuous time. It was the era of, it was Watergate. It was Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. We had a president of the United States who actually resigned his office because of Watergate. But what people don't often remember is that there were articles of impeachment actually drawn up. And one of the articles of impeachment was drawn up, amongst several, was the abuse of power, using national instruments, national agencies, to abuse the rights of Americans, the rights of individuals. And in particular, what came out during the Church Pike Committee hearings, extraordinary set of hearings, particularly the Church Committee in 1975, Frank Church actually warned the nation, after all these revelations about secret spy operations against Americans, dissidents, war protesters, journalists, and reporters on a pretty significant scale. And yet the era, the post-9/11 surveillance world makes that era look like hikers. And so we put into place a number of reforms, including intelligence oversight committees. We had a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was a legal regime using the Fourth Amendment's probable cause standard. You could not violate the rights of a U.S. person without a warrant. And that regime applied to NSA, because NSA had severely abused its own power in secret for many, many decades prior, but particularly during the 60s and 70s. Operations like Operation Shamrock, bulk copy access to all telegrams for many, many decades, going into and out of the United States. And the reason I'm mentioning this is important, and there's a much larger story here, that the culture of NSA, for all of its legacy and all of the extraordinary breakthroughs in computing, for all that it did during the Cold War, in terms of the existential threat of communism, many of those successes that we'll read about in history, probably decades from now, or as classification, things that were secret that will become revealed in terms of formally revealed over the next few decades. For all of that, when it came to NSA, targeting, collecting, analyzing, intercepting, if it was overseas, if it was not a U.S. citizen, a U.S. person, it was fair game. It's important to understand that. It's also important to understand in terms of history that the foundations for the post 9/11 surveillance state didn't just happen because of 9/11. In the United States in 1947, the National Security Act was passed. That established, for the first time in U.S. history, a standing mechanism by which we would never have another surprise again. We would never have another electronic Pearl Harbor, but established a permanent infrastructure in terms of defense, including intelligence. The heart of that infrastructure grew over the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower talked about. That all grew over the intervening decade. It did not go away because of the end of the Cold War. And in fact, it was leveraged with all the advances in technology, the very technology that Senator Frank Church warned the nation about. It was leveraged in an extraordinary way in the deepest of secrecy after 9/11. So I just want to put the face of history here, because if we don't learn the lessons of history, guess what? Yes, this is back when you actually had individual boards. You could actually see the slots and chips, and nowadays, I used to do all this. I used to hack a lot of this. Used to do software modifications, even at the board level on these chips. I used to fly this airplane. I'm showing you this airplane. I was stationed at RAF Mildenhall in the United Kingdom. We used to call ourselves the vacuum cleaner of the sky. Between 0.2 and 18 gigahertz, we could pretty much take any signal that was out there in that portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. But our focus was foreign intelligence, and we were absolutely forbidden, even if we incidentally picked up U.S. person communications. You could not keep it, you could not retain it. There were special procedures to minimize if you had both, and in fact there was criminal sanctions. If you violated the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, it was $10,000 fine and 5 years in prison for every instance. Every instance. That legal regime, under the constraints of the Fourth Amendment, which in itself was a compromise passed in 1978 under the Carter administration, was the regime in place for 23 years. And what I was confronted with after 9/11, and I'm talking within days of 9/11, was the reality that the United States, in the deepest of secrecy, unchained itself from the Constitution. It separated itself from the rule of law. And it invoked executive privilege and state secrets, and FISA was completely abandoned. And in a democracy, you cannot have secret government coexisting with a democratic government. Something has to give, and that's been giving ever since. I also flew on this aircraft, electronic warfare. It was a wartime mission. We were absolutely forbidden to collect, retain, or store any U.S. person information. On occasion, this was a jamming platform. You could actually prevent people from communicating, bad people from communicating, bad in quotes. We used to do war exercises in certain places in the United States, particularly out west. And every so often, you'd forget and throw the switch to active. Sometimes you'd knock a radio station offline by accident. This legal regime was, and this is the 1980s, the late 80s, this legal regime was crucial because of the violations of the Constitution and law. And you can't just have what were already very secret agencies simply deciding in secret that we're just going to collect and monitor and spy on people without a purpose. And if it was a U.S. citizen in particular, you had to have a warrant, although there were conditions under which you could do hot pursuit. But here's where the transition occurs, and I was right at that transition. That's why I said when I grew up in the golden age of computing, we're moving from an analog world, circuit-based technology, to packet-based, digital internet. Industrial age, first information and knowledge age. I make reference to this because the structures that were in place, the formal structures put into place right after World War II, were all based on industrial age mindsets, industrial age thinking. And so to understand how we got here, we have to couch this in terms of the industrial age. This is machines, and people were objects, cogs in the machine, industrial age, right? So if you're using industrial age mentality to solve information age challenges, you might come up short. I think Einstein had something to say about that. Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. I mention this because after 9/11, NSA answered the challenge posed by 9/11 in the deepest of secrets by saying we're just going to own the net. We're going to own the net. A couple other things to keep in mind. What we're seeing created since 9/11 and the extraordinary disclosures, the continuing disclosures that are coming out from Edward Snowden through journalists and reporters, is really the creation of a digital panopticon. Panopticon was actually a concept in terms of a prison in which the guard, overseer, could see everybody at once. You'd always, a constant gaze. You'd always know what the prisoners were doing. We actually have this now in terms of how far the surveillance state has penetrated the very fabric of our society. But it's done silently. It's virtually. You can't always see it. It's always behind the scenes. It's not one of those things you can just touch. We used to joke about software being the lifeblood of information technology when I was in that business for a number of years, and as a principal of a couple of boutique.coms and doing a lot of consulting out in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. But you just don't go outside and start digging and all of a sudden software just spills out of the ground. And yet, so much of our lives, just think about your own lives and how much of it has become digitized. And all the records are available of who you are, at least transactionally. But this constant gaze of surveillance, what's it doing to us as a society? This is a quote attributed to Daniel Moynihan. Secrecy is for losers. And this is a quote from a book he wrote some years ago about what does secrecy really entail. I'm the first to tell you, having been in the system, that there are secrets worth keeping. But if everything becomes a secret, because in the digital age, information is the currency of power. The currency of power. The motto, the Stasi, that I became intimately familiar with, listening in on East German communications, was to know everything. To know everything. Does that equal total information awareness? They became monstrously efficient at these incredibly well-indexed files, paper-based file systems on everybody in their country and then some. And they built a wall around their country to keep people in. Their motto was to know everything. If you haven't read the latest issue of Rolling Stone, there's a very long-form article by investigative journalist Janet Reitman. I'm extensively quoted in there. This is a quote attributed to Edward Snowden. This is particularly true if done in secret. Another quote in this article. I'm showing you this one in particular because what was I confronted with shortly after 9/11 to my horror? That under the excuse of 9/11, 9/11 having been a systemic failure of the United States government under the preamble of the Constitution, a failure to provide for the common defense, a failure to keep Americans and foreign nationals out of harm's way, and 3,000 people were murdered on 9/11, my first actual day on the job at NSA. The next 4 months were a blur for me, but what I was confronted with within days and weeks was the surreality of my own government in the deepest of secrecy, subverting the very Constitution it was bound to uphold and defend, and added to that, knowing it was never necessary to go to the dark side. That the very best of American ingenuity
in inventiveness, necessity being the mother of invention, had already solved the challenge problem, could do so, and still go after the threat, like Al-Qaeda and associated movements and other threats to international order and stability, and still absolutely protect the rights of citizens. Period. End of story. Never allowed. It was never allowed to be put into the fight. This is an extraordinarily powerful statement because I was eyewitness myself to the foundational programs of which you're now hearing about through the Edward Snowden disclosures. The very foundational surveillance programs like Stellar Wind, which were for domestic collection on an extraordinarily vast scale, turning the United States of America into the equivalent of a foreign nation for the purpose of dragnet electronic surveillance. Total violation of not just the Fourth Amendment, but the Constitution. No warrant whatsoever. Just picking up millions and millions of phone records, including location information, in the fall of 2001. So I've been reliving the past 12 years. And just like Edward Snowden did, it was my duty to act. Because if I had remained silent, I'd be complicit in a crime. I was eyewitness to the subversion of the United States Constitution, which, by the way, was the only thing that, quote unquote, makes the United States different in terms of governance. It was a grand experiment. No guarantee that it would last or persist. Empires have come and gone in human history. It was a grand experiment. The idea of how to best govern ourselves, all of its faults and contradictions. I had taken an oath 4 times to support and defend that Constitution. The idea and how to govern ourselves. And yet, I'm faced right after 9/11 with the reality that this incredibly secret agency is absolutely subverting the Constitution. It's completely abandoning the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was the prime directive of NSA. You did not spy on Americans without a warrant. And although there was conditions for hot pursuit where you could actually go after a real target, a real threat, you still have to go back for a warrant. An existential threat to democracy. I've heard this. Now, I'm going to run an exercise with you here in a few minutes to really bring this home on a very deeply personal level. Remember, I said I've already lived the surveillance state. I don't want anybody else to live it in the future, let alone now. I have done nothing wrong. I have nothing to hide. Anybody know where this quote actually came from? Who, in terms of history? This quote is attributed to a particular person during the Nazi era, Goebbels. You have nothing to worry about if you have nothing to hide. As if that's the reason why the government needs to know everything there is to know about you. So you don't get to define that in this space. The government does. And so that's classic Orwellian doublespeak, because how do you know in the land of the shadows what's being done with the data? It's one thing to collect it. It's another thing to store it. It's yet another thing to retain it. But what is it being used for and for what purpose? Remember, if you want perfect security, you have to give up all liberty and freedom. I served in the military, in the Air Force. I also served as an intel officer in the Navy down at the Pentagon. I happened to be on the terrorism desk in 1993 during a period of about 18 months when certain radical Islamists attempted to drop the World Trade Center towers the first time. We sent out reports about this person named Osama bin Laden in Al-Qaeda, known translated as the base. That this guy was serious, his movement was serious. It was more existential in nature. Completely dismissed by those that the reports went to. I remember the senior general, the senior military officer in the Department of Defense in the military who actually reports to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon, coming down to our space saying, who cares? And I'm going to use a pejorative. Who cares about some raghead spouting off in the desert? Not a threat. And we said, and issued reports, they're not giving up. They're going to come back. They're going to come back. No one would listen. So what happens when you trade liberty for security? Is if there's actually a choice, which I'd argue is a false dichotomy. It's an interesting straw man that is posited by those who have reasons to keep the surveillance state in place and secrecy in place. Well, here's a quote from Benjamin Franklin. Two wolves and a lamb, democracy, voting on what to have for lunch. Liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote. Who do you think's going to win? There's versions of that involving fox guarding hen house. Okay? Now, the top quote is interesting because history has said, purportedly, that a woman reporter actually came up to Benjamin Franklin at the end of that very hot summer in Philadelphia in 1787, where they had met in secret for many, many weeks to hammer out a new constitution because the Articles of Confederation were an abysmal failure. And we just had, a few years earlier before that, you had had the American Revolution. Things weren't looking too good for the new nation. And asked, hey, what did you guys do in there? And he purportedly said, what did you guys do? What did you create? A republic if you can keep it. A republic if you can keep it. So what expired on 9/11? I would say that the Constitution expired. I would say that we actually had the equivalent of a coup d'etat after 9/11 in the deepest of secrecy, government unchaining itself from the very foundation of the country. And then billions and billions and billions of dollars being pumped in to make us feel safe again. And in fact, that was a mantra in NSA. We need to make Americans feel safe again. Fear is an extraordinarily powerful motivator. Now, here's another reality. Completely turns Western system of justice. I'll speak to the Western. Our other systems of justice, I'll speak to the Western system of justice, under which both our nations have as heritage. In a surveillance state, everybody's suspicious. Everybody. It's assumed. You have to continue to prove that you're not. And again, you add this, have you done anything wrong? It's the government determining in secret, often in secret, whether or not you are. And as I can well attest to, if you exercise your inalienable rights, if you exercise under the U.S. Constitution, the First Amendment, the power to assemble with others, if you exercise your right to go to the free press, if you exercise your right to express your own opinion, right? Sovereign rights, by the way, that makes you a target, especially if it's taking issue with the national security state. Judge Keith, this is a ruling all the way back to August of 2002. This is when even the third branch of the U.S. government, the third branch, by the way, which is extraordinary in my own case. I actually said that on the steps of the courthouse after my sentencing, that there is a third branch of government. Because my own judge, Judge Richard Bennett, who had been appointed under the Bush administration, took the government to task. We don't do this to Americans. We don't take 2.5 years to figure out a way in which to charge them criminally. Didn't pass the smell test, unconscionable. It's the reason we had an American Revolution. Democracies die behind closed doors. What I was eyewitness to after 9/11 was not just the wheels coming off the existing vehicle. We were in an entirely new vehicle, and it was alien. Deportation hearings in secret. You cannot have secret evidence, secret courts, secret testimony. It's anathema to democracy, and it ultimately erodes liberty and freedom. So here's some additional quotes in the context of the previous slide. Because if you operate democracy behind closed doors, guess what you control? There is no opposition. There is no informing the public. You don't know what else there is. Information becomes highly selective. Fundamentally, the First Amendment was designed to protect the people against secret government. And so I became a traitor in the eyes of our government. In fact, even early on, I'll just give you one taste of this. as I began to blow the whistle within the system, through all proper channels over a number of years, in early 2002, when I was a material witness for the first 9/11 congressional investigation with then Representative Saxby Chambliss, who headed up a subcommittee on the House Intel Committee in the U.S. Congress, I was pulled aside by my reporting official, the number 3 individual NSA, and was told, watch out, they're looking for leakers. Now, this wasn't leakers to the press. That happened later, when the secret surveillance programs started to come out in public. No, this is leakers to Congress. They wanted me to obstruct an official investigation into NSA's role in 9/11. Obstruct the investigation. And I was warned. I was warned. I don't want us to live this future. I don't want us, either as individual nations, partner nations, and neighbors, to live a dystopian future. 1984, to me, is much too real. And that was supposedly a novel. The government found out everything they could about me. They took the most powerful electron microscope you can think of and just have the government spend year after year just drilling down everything there is to know about you. Everything. To the point where there's literally no privacy left at all. And this is precisely what has happened in the United States. And unfortunately, it's happening in other democracies, including Canada, and including some really pernicious conduct on the part of the United Kingdom. You expose high crimes and misdemeanors as defined under the Constitution, it becomes a criminal act. You dare not blow the whistle on secret power, because they have power over you, and they'll be sure to use it against you. I'm a canary in the coal mine of what happens. And there are those who will say, yes, I get the message, Tom. The last thing I want to do is speak up about any wrongdoing. The last thing I want to do is speak up about any threats to public safety or health. The last thing I want to do is speak up about any government illegality. Because if I do, I will be exposed. I end up losing my job within NSA by virtue of having cooperated in multiple investigations. This is before anything else happened in terms of any public knowledge about these secret programs, or the multi-billion-dollar fraud, waste, and abuse NSA, or the incalculable loss of intelligence because NSA did not share critical information that could have stopped 9/11 all by itself, or information they had in their database they didn't even know was there, that was discovered later by a program in which I was the head of. In early 2002, it was so embarrassing to NSA, they shut it down. Now you tell me who's committing the wrongdoing. You tell me. Don't you want to know what the real threats are to the country, legitimate threats? And yet, when you actually find and discover information that can help roll up those threats, even after 9/11, you shut it down? So 9/11 opened up a Pandora's box, and this is like the dark side history. Remember, 5 days after 9/11, on the 16th of September 2001, then Vice President Cheney actually went on national television and said, we're going to have to go to the dark side. I don't think people fully appreciated what that meant. What did that mean? I confronted the lead attorney at NSA the first week in October because it was my moment of truth. In that conversation, he said, you don't understand, Mr. Drake. It's all legal. The White House has approved it. As soon as he said that, the hair is going up on the back of my neck because I'm recalling what Nixon claimed in the David Frost interviews. If the president says it's legal, it is. The president says it is, it must be because the president says so. And I thought in the 70s, because he resigned from office, although he was pardoned by Ford, and some people take issue with that, okay? He was pardoned by Ford, that no one was above the law, no one was above the Constitution, not even the president. And then I was warned, don't ask any more questions. What I didn't know, by the way, is that President Bush in that same week had signed a secret presidential directive authorizing NSA to turn the United States into the equivalent of a foreign nation for dragnet electronic surveillance on a vast scale. First, starting with all phone records. Sound familiar? Including location information. All emails. All financial transactions, including credit card information. On a vast scale, and internet usage. Sound familiar? I gave everything I knew to 9/11 congressional investigations and others within the system. But as I found out later, to my horror, none of the material evidence I gave about those foundational programs and all the fraud, waste, and abuse, and the incalculable loss of intelligence and the violation of the Constitution, and all the other laws in place at the time, government completely bypassing it, it was all suppressed and censored. And why? As I found out, NSA said that's a state secret, it cannot even be in the secret report. So, to re-paraphrase Orwell, truth is the first casualty of war, even when it's undeclared. And propaganda is a pretense of the powerful. And so, as George Orwell actually says, truth is treason and the empire lies. I've lived precisely that, because I had no assurance when I was actually charged with a 10 felony count indictment facing 35 years in prison, April 2010. I was not certain that truth could prevail in the court of law. Even though I had rights as an American, the government had many, many arrows in its quiver. You might remember some telling quotes, by the way, from Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope, but others, right, about control. Yeah, I used to work here, 6th floor of that building in front, other places as well, Sigint Central. So here, I'm going to run an exercise now, a privacy exercise. I've been running this exercise now for a number of months. Every time I run this exercise, everybody, except with one person in California, said maybe, always says no. So I'm going to indulge you for a moment. And for those who are watching live through the stream, I want you to take the keys to your car. I want you to take the keys to your house. I want you to take every password you have for every account you own or have access to. I want you to take all of your health records, all your bank records, all your credit card statements, all of your tax records, everything there is to know about you. I want you to put into a box. Now, what you're going to do is you get in your car. Okay, you do have a second set of keys. Okay, haven't taken those yet. You drive across town, you knock on the door of a perfect stranger, but they're a fellow Canadian citizen. And when they open up the door, you're face to face, you say, "Here, fellow Canadian citizen, I'm giving you my life, my digital life, and all my records for safekeeping." Would you do it? No, no, no. Various forms of no. Why not? You don't trust them. Interesting, trust. That intangible thing we call trust. Trust is so fundamental to human relationships in community and who we are, one individual to another. You don't trust. That's usually the response, or a version of that. I don't trust them. But wait a minute. I'm actually going to come back here at you a bit. This is a fellow Canadian citizen. This is not a foreign national. This is not some terrorist, right, hiding out as a Canadian citizen. They're upright. They have nothing to hide. They obey the law. They're great. They're upstanding members of their community. You are willfully consenting, right? Because you're a consenting adult, one to another. And you're not willing to give them your life for safekeeping because you don't trust them. And so my answer is, if you don't trust a fellow Canadian citizen, face to face, no coercion, by consent, you're choosing to give them your digital life for safekeeping. If you're not willing to trust your fellow Canadian citizen, then why would you trust your government in secret? Why? You know exactly what's in that box. You're not willing to trust a fellow Canadian citizen, but if the government does it in secret and collects it, there's some higher purpose here? I'm just going to leave you that. Just so that's the dark side of personal data. It's unprecedented in human history for government in secret to have persistent information day after day, week after week. So here's the current example I'm going to give you. Is there anybody in this room that doesn't have a cell phone on them or in their purse or within arm's reach? Wow, 2 people raised their hands. Now, of the 2 people that raise their hands, do you actually own a cell phone? Wow. So everybody owns a cell phone in this room. Do you know that cell phone is a built-in tracking device? Even when it's turned off. You know what the latest revelations are? Why I shiver when I saw them, although none of the Edward Snowden disclosure have surprised me in the least. 5 billion records each and every day being collected, retained by NSA worldwide. Massive amounts of records on U.S. citizens, Canadian citizens, citizens in Europe, and across the world. 5 billion. If I had access to everything there is to know about your cell phone, because every time you use your cell phone, even when you're not using it, it has to connect to a cell tower. And just like I was confronted with in the fall of 2001, realizing what NSA was collecting from the Verizons, the Sprints, and AT&Ts of the world, that vast, rich repository of metadata information, including location information, what would I end up knowing about you just from the tracking information alone? You think there might be a reasonable expectation of privacy unless the government thinks there's probable cause? But hey, you've done nothing wrong, right? You think? We're not even talking about the content of your phone calls. By the way, that's another one of those interesting revelations I think will be coming out. Because the U.S. government said, oh no, we only collect metadata. Then we collect content as well, and technology. So you have this weird paradox. The cost of technology for a government surveillance state is increasingly approaching 0. The cost to actually store, I can put a terabyte of information on my thumb easily. Easily. Practically the fingernail, truth be told. A terabyte. We have zettabytes of information being created, zettabytes. So how much is that? It's just a lot of bytes, is what I say. Okay. Staggering amounts of information. You wonder what the Bluffdale facility is, although they're having problems now because they can't keep the electricity up. And they're blowing out transformers and boxes. Why would you need such an extraordinarily large facility to store just metadata? I can put the metadata in a couple of rooms this size of the entire world. Just think about it. I have all this information at my disposal. Anybody seen the movie The Lives of Others? The East German movie, extremely disturbing, but for me, I won't spoil it for the rest, but it's what actually happens after the end of the Cold War and after the collapse of the East German fascist surveillance state. This weird hybrid communist dictatorship, weird hybrid, okay? With all the dark side Prussian stuff thrown in and authority, it collapsed in 1989. It's what happened to the prime actor in there, but basically the centerpiece. He was the playwright writer. What happened to him when he discovered, much to his horror, what was buried inside of his Stasi files that were released later? He had boxes and boxes in front of him. It's what he discovered after. You just have to ask the question. Because, see, it's one thing to say, hey, it's okay to collect all this. Somehow the haystack, I need the whole haystack because any one of those straws could be a needle. So just in case a straw is a needle, we need everything. That's precisely what I was told when I confronted NSA senior leadership. You don't understand. We live in a different time now, Tom. Like somehow 9/10 dramatically different, 9/11. I get 9/11 was, but it was also a fundamental failure, a systemic failure. You don't understand. Extraordinary times require extraordinary means. Hey, if you've done nothing wrong, who cares if we have access to all your data? Oh, by the way, we're not actually looking at it. It's just there in case we need it later. Here's the bottom line for me, what I was confronted with. Both. After 9/11, Congress decided to pump massive amounts of money into NSA. It was sort of like NSA is a balloon, and here is the gas, and how much money can you take, NSA? Put NSA on steroids in terms of funding, and all kinds of supplemental funding, billions and billions and billions. I still remember 50th anniversary of the creation of NSA in 2002. It was a gala affair. We were all dressed up, fancy flowers and bands and everything else. And they had the head table with the Haydens and George Tenets of the world. Trying not to be too cynical here. And yet on stage, remember, I don't know what you have in Canada. I don't know, just used to do the publishers' clearinghouse with these huge checks, and you'd show up and, you know, the big fake check, you know, several million. Well, there was a check that had billions written on it. Okay, I won't say precisely how many. Okay, but it was more than 9 figures. And it was the House, one of the House staff managers, the HIPC Intel Committee staff managers, handing this check off to General Hayden. And all I could see Hayden's looking down at George Tenet and then back to the check saying, George, I got my money. I got my money. My immediate supervisor, attempting to console the workforce, because the workforce realized that we had failed the nation, fundamentally had failed the nation. We had not prevented the next digital Pearl Harbor. Failed. Said that 9/11 was a gift to NSA. A gift to NSA. And that's why I said we sold out national security. And billions of dollars were pumped in. Massive amounts of contracts were created. All kinds of people I used to work with were made into millionaires almost overnight. I give people their fair due. However, it was all unnecessary, completely. So, internet is now a state-sponsored surveillance platform. Harvesting data, and I'm using the word harvesting on purpose. See, here's an irony in terms of history. Anybody know the history of internet? I still have a piece of paper at home that has internet on one sheet, 8.5 by 11. A couple of few universities and a couple of government institutions. One sheet. The government invented internet, ARPA, to deal with the nuclear winter. What happens? You blew out all your communication nodes, and still you get the message out. How ironic that they now want to take it back from us. For all the extraordinary benefits of internet, NSA has fundamentally weakened the infrastructure. That's a fact. We're paying a very high cost now. The United States companies are now waking up to the fact they're already losing business, and they're projected, some of the studies have said, upwards of several tens of billions of dollars over the next intervening years in lost revenue. Of course, some will blame Snowden for that, without actually holding up the mirror. This is on a truly vast scale, and this is just one way to represent it. This is actually an older representation. How do you get your hands around 5 billion records a day? How do you get your hands around the -80 order, the orders that I knew of, never actually saw the documentation, although I was aware of the every 45-day order signed in secret by Bush, authorizing, quote unquote, the FBI in the deepest of secrecy, bypassing the secret court, no warrant at all. Hey, Verizon, turn over all your records at NSA each and every day. They were doing that after 9/11. Shortly after 9/11. Now you get a -80 order, first time anybody's seen a secret court order compelling Verizon to turn over to NSA all those, that 120 million subscribers, all that information, each and every day. More challenges. It's important to note the second bullet. Because I blew the whistle on all of this within the system. And then I was confronted with the reality after yet another multi-year investigation at NSA involving the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General, in which I was also a material witness whistleblower. It's now 2005. In late 2005, I sent, which I will be the first to acknowledge, was a pretty strong letter to General Keith Alexander. Four-star general, heads up both NSA and Cyber Command. And I laid it out for him in terms of what had happened. I got a very short response, basically just saying, sorry, not going in that direction, I already have the solution at hand. His solution was a multi-billion-dollar response to the failure of Trailblazer. And he took the foundation that Hayden had laid for him and handed him on a silver surveillance platform and just institutionalized it on an extraordinarily vast scale. So knowledge is control for some. Remember, information is the currency of power. And ironically, at NSA, if I keep the information, if I have it, if I hoard it, that gives me power. If I give it to you, if I give you, I lose my power. Just think about it. And so James Risen and Eric Lichtblau, the New York Times, wrote this blockbuster article in December 2005 revealing for the first time the existence of the so-called warrantless wiretapping program, which the government conveniently and quickly labeled the terrorist surveillance program. They were desperate to protect the domestic surveillance program, which is really what became known as the president's surveillance program. Here's at best. There's at worst. What's the result? And I live right now with the distinct reality, the distinct burden of what could have been. I can't relive history that didn't happen. All I can do is I ended up dealing with the history that did happen. But I was confronted with it directly. And so I made a fateful decision. Although I had nothing to do with the New York Times article, the government actually made me much more than I was, as it turns out. They actually thought I was the ringleader for that New York Times article. Because there was no evidence, I must have been a really good spy and hit all my trails. I must have been as good as Edward Snowden in not getting detected. The reality is that my life was turned upside down. Okay? So imagine for the moment, you're getting ready for work. At the time, I had lost my job at NSA. I ended up applying for another one because they basically after the letter to Alexander, they reorganized the Directorate of Engineering, in which I was a senior executive. I had no job after that reorganization. And so I realized the handwriting was on the wall. That I finally now had no job. All I had was an office, had no money, had no contracts, no administrative assistants, no team. It was just me. And so I ended up going down to the National Defense University to teach as a visiting professor of behavioral science. And November 28, 2007, I'm looking out my bedroom window and I see a dozen FBI agents streaming across the front yard. Now, 4 months earlier, my colleagues that I worked with and who I had blown the whistle with, Diane Wark, who had the NSA account at the House Intel Committee, Ed Loomis, Kirk Wiebe, and Bill Binney were unceremoniously raided, essentially simultaneously, East and West Coast, 4 months earlier. And I knew when that happened that I was now in the bullseye. And the nightmare had begun. It was the top of the news at night, top of the news that evening, night, and in the morning. All kinds of rumors. I ended up cooperating with the FBI for 5 months to report high crimes and misdemeanors. They didn't want to hear about that. They wanted to hear about how I had, quote unquote, caused exceptionally grave damage to the national security of the United States. And in April of 2008, while I was trying to clear my head in New York City, I got a phone call from one of the FBI agents who basically had borrowed from their mole hunter unit. This is the elite unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation to go after real spies. That's how serious they were about this. In fact, it turns out they put 5 full-time prosecutors and 25 full-time agents to find the quote-unquote leakers to the New York Times article. And because the set of people who knew about the stellar wind and the secret surveillance was extremely small, as well as the multi-billion-dollar fraud called Trailblazer and all the related programs, and Thin Thread, which they had defied congressional legislation and its signature into law by the president to deploy Thin Thread to the 18 most critical counterterrorism sites in the world. Never did get deployed, interestingly enough. There I was, and I was asked by the FBI agent to come to a secret FBI facility, no windows, classified facility in the greater DC area. When I got there, this is now my third meeting with FBI. I'd already had about 12 plus hours of interviews with them, interrogations. I was met for the first time by the chief prosecutor. Now this isn't secret evidence, secret law, secret prosecution at this point. And I pause, because I just want you to get a sense of my space. This is April of 2008. My life was already upside down. This is 2 full years before I was indicted. So publicly. He said, how would you like to spend the rest of your life in prison, Mr. Drake? Unless you cooperate with our investigation. Have you ever imagined what it'd be like to spend the rest of your life in prison? I'm a relatively young man. I still had half my life in front of me. I'm now facing the chief prosecutor, knowing the government is hell-bent on destroying me, and if necessary, putting me away for a long, long time. Because this goes all the way back to the American Revolution, and I have some familiarity with Canadian history, given where I grew up in Vermont. I become a Benedict Arnold. I betrayed my country. I was one of the most trusted, as Benedict Arnold, one of the most trusted senior, in his case, general under George Washington. And he turned, being a traitor. You were once one of us, you're now one of them. I was an enemy of the state. And I knew that I could no longer cooperate with the FBI. And I knew that my entire future was now at risk. And so 2 years later, in an extremely public way, they launched and announced the indictment on me, and I faced 35 years in prison. I spent the next 14 months defending my life and to keep my freedom. Now, some people have asked, why would you have done all that, Tom? Anybody follow Star Trek? Well, I'm not quite a Trekkie. I've never been to any of the Star Trek or Trekkie conventions. The second movie with the original cast, after the series ended, this is the Wrath of Khan, Ricardo Montalban, who had become obsessed with doing in James Tiberius Kirk, captain of the USS Enterprise. There's a scene in that movie, a famous Star Trek scene, in which Spock, Kirk's best friend, sacrifices his life to save the crew. And Scotty, the chief engineer, calls up to the bridge and says, "You got to get down here, Jim." Jim rushes down and says, "Scotty, or Spock, why?" He says, famous line as he's dying in front of Kirk, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one." See, if the sovereignty of who we are as human beings matters, if we are in fact blessed with certain inalienable rights, amongst those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as so eloquently declared in the Declaration of Independence, then it does matter. I will never, I'll say this again publicly here, and for those watching and those who will watch later from the saved feeds, I will never, ever sacrifice my sovereignty. I will never forsake who I am for the sake of the state. History is not kind. Not kind at all. See, the history of liberty is also the history of government power. With great power comes great responsibility. If you exercise great power in secret, given the human condition, then you can exercise great irresponsibility. And the thing about secret power, I thought we had sort of tackled this with the Magna Carta like a few centuries ago, where the divine right of the kings was, that's why this Q is to question all authority. Question, especially. Always question, but especially authority. That the serfs, the servants, and those indentured did have rights. King couldn't just rule because he said so. And it came from some existential place. That people, individuals, had rights. In the course of human history and progress in terms of who we are and freedom and liberty, what I was faced with right after 2001, what Edward Snowden was faced with 12 years later, seeing the full metastasization of that whole entire edifice and apparatus, now fully institutionalized, now being given a full legal framework, the very phrase that President Obama himself said on the Jon Stewart show, that part of his legacy was create a legal framework. The last time I checked, the only legal framework in which a government is obligated to support and defend is the Constitution, and he has a special obligation to preserve, protect, and defend as the President of the United States. It's not his place to simply say the Constitution doesn't matter or to reinterpret it for his own purposes. And so we have this interesting conundrum with power. We truly do. Because the very technology is neutral. It can be used for either good or for evil. It can be used and repurposed for other things. Do we really want this much power being given to our own governments in secret? As I've said, it's eating out the heart of democracy. It's a cancer on liberty. These are questions you need to ask of your government. These are questions you need to ask of authority. Remember what happened to me was I came off the airplane in Toronto. That chilling third question, asking me for papers defined as an invitation letter. Papers. Papers. Show me your papers. So these are fundamental questions because I want to get to the Q&A. I know we'll have a small break, and I want to have an extended Q&A with you because I know I'm just touching on any number of things, and even my own history, I'm just giving you a thumbnail perspective. This is serious stuff. If we're talking about the panopticon, do we really want the government having the ability in secret to essentially have unfettered observation of everything we do, or the equivalent of everything we do? It's unequal. The gaze, that constant gaze, is unequal. The paradigm has been flipped, that somehow secrecy, and a government official actually recently said this, that somehow secrecy is actually the privacy of the government and they get to protect it. But your privacy, the privacy of citizens, is fair game. Now you tell me, for example, having some knowledge of interesting arrangements and partnerships between NSA and CSEC and GCHQ, you tell me one example of what value is it, except because you can and because they happen to be a foreign leader, of what value is it to spend 11 years monitoring the personal cell phone of Angela Merkel? Or because it's convenient, we have the technology, I can monitor on an extraordinarily vast scale the comings and goings electronically of all the attendees to the G8 and G20 summit. Far beyond the need to protect those who come together. Because if you remember, information is power. If I'm working out agreements, if I'm angling for resources, economic, industrial, or otherwise, you think it might be just tempting enough if I have the power and secret to just pick that up and use it for other purposes? Now, I'm the first to tell you, having been in the business, you know, it's kind of the old spy versus spy, right? The comic book. But this is serious business. And what does it do to society? We have to ask that question, because history's not kind. Consider this. This is the thing that I was confronted with after 9/11. See, I became very aware that those who have this kind of power, without constraints, without chains that bind them down, without oversight, if it's done without your permission, without your consent, the consent of the governed, in a democracy, democracy can only exist for all of its weaknesses. It'll consume itself if it's not with the consent of the governed. But particularly when it's done in secret, that's the ultimate form of control. If you watch the Lives of Others movie, the ability to listen in on someone else's life, you get addicted to it. Addicted to it. And at any time, with the click of a button, I can find out, or through files, rifling through files, find out what there is about this person. If they become, and may watch the Person of Interest show. This is where art, by the way, art meets reality, fantasy. There's an episode of Person of Interest that was actually based, several characters, one based on me, one based on my colleague, Bill Binney, and others. It's kind of weird when you're watching an episode and you realize that they're patterning it after yourself, one of the characters. Still strange for me. Here's the real problem. This is a fairly dramatic statement, but given what I was faced with, because see, remember, I have a special burden, but I also have extraordinary freedom because I was able to keep my freedoms. You know what it means not to have your freedoms and liberties taken away? After all those years, the government trying their best to put me away for a long, long time, there was actually congressmen looking forward to seeing me in an orange jumpsuit. So, internet. So much of our lives are on internet. Only the government, I'm just going to say it here in my last couple of minutes before we have a break and turn over Q&A. Only the government can create a police state. That technology, as one of my colleagues has said quite eloquently, turnkey tyranny. Remember, I became an expert in East Germany. I remember flying along what's called the inter-German border, looking out from 35, 40,000 feet and seeing the ditch, which was that zone of control on the eastern side of the border. You could actually see it from that high up. It was quite obvious. Hundreds and hundreds of miles. Do we really want that kind of state? Because in essence, we have the equivalent of that. No. We don't live in the Stasi regime in Canada or the United States. But the government has certainly been abusing its powers. And I've said this, I'll say it again, we have the equivalent of a digital fence around us. That digital fence is the equivalent of a one-way mirror most of the time for the government. They get extraordinary access to information about us. We have very little insight and access to what they're doing with what they're seeing, and then what they're taking from what they're seeing, and how are they repurposing it for other uses. You have a case of a Canadian citizen who was refused entry because apparently there was information about, again, quote me if I'm wrong, I remember you were giving me the example, but a citizen who apparently the government found out they had some kind of health issue. They had had counseling. They were refused entry into the country. Refused entry. Now, how do they get a hold of that? Do you know, I said this to the professor earlier, I had a minor outpatient surgery several years ago, very minor, but I had to sign papers. And one of the paragraphs in which I was signing kind of the terms and conditions as a patient, that these records could be released for national security purposes. National security purposes? Wow. So you have to ask the question. I have people in denial. I have people in my friends, and colleagues who just don't want to believe this. They don't want to believe. And so they'll tell me. They'll say, Tom, yeah, I agree with you. Tom, yeah, governments are running amok, or it's too late. But I'm not going to do what you did. And here's why. Because I have a job. I've got kids in school. I don't want to jeopardize my retirement, and I got a mortgage to pay. I understand in terms of Abraham Maslow hierarchy of needs that many people live down at that lower level. Is that the society we want to live in? I don't think so. I did not grow up in Texas and Vermont to live in the society that we actually face. Here's some more points to ponder. These are questions just to ask. You don't necessarily need answers right now. We just can't kid ourselves. See, I gave a talk out at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco a couple of months after the end of when I was sentenced, the 1-year probation and 240 hours of community service, where I interviewed veterans from World War II to the present day. And I know it was the web elites, the internet elites were there, and I know I made people very uncomfortable because you have commercial interests monetizing your personal data. See, what's the interesting thing about the information age? What's unique is who you are and everything about you. Well, that's by definition, but all of your transactions are unique as they link to you. Monetizing your data. And there's ways to monetize that. You can have choice, terms and conditions. Well, guess what? Some of these companies, like the Microsofts of the world, like the Verizon of the world, they get it both ways. What do you mean? They're not turning over this information to the government for free. They're not giving access without your consent. Remember that thing about putting your life in a box? The government looking inside your account? That's what you're faced with. That's just based on the latest disclosures. PRISM. And so we need to ask this question about what tale do we want to tell to our future generations? Because here's the fundamental reality. You cannot compromise with secret power. Because what's happening is any attempt to protect who you are, I speak from direct personal experience on the receiving end of the surveillance state, is regarded as you're up to no good. If you use encryption, that's a flag, you're up to no good. You must be hiding something, otherwise you wouldn't use encryption. If that's the case, then that's why I ran the exercise with you. If you say you don't care, then just leave your car doors unlocked tonight. Leave your house unlocked. Just give up on your passwords. Any wireless network you have, just shut down all the accesses. Just make it wide open. Make it not just free, wide open. Hey, just because you trust the government, right? You trust everybody else. I don't think so. Because if this is the complete reversal, there is a thing in U.S. history, and it's a paradox, that we're best governed if we're least governed. This is Jeffersonian principle, and for all the faults of the founding fathers, even that phrase is overloaded. Okay? What is the proper necessary role of national government? I can only speak as an American, because for me, I took an oath 4 times to support and defend the Constitution. One thing I've continued to remember in the preamble of the U.S. Constitution is it starts off with we the people. It doesn't say we the government, it doesn't say we the power, it doesn't say we the executive or we Congress. It says we the people in order to form a more perfect union. They recognized then it was not a perfect union. In order to form a perfect union, it's a continuous process. I didn't sign up or take an oath to form a more perfect disunion. I didn't. I already mentioned this. Unfortunately, this arrangement, and I'm going to say it here, I'm going to say it publicly, let's say it is against the U.S. law to violate the rights under the 4th Amendment of a U.S. person without a warrant. Okay, that's literally the case in the 4th Amendment. And then you've got what was the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Now it's the Barn Door Enabling Act. Well, you know, it's kind of convenient when you have this arrangement with the U.S., Canada, and the U.K., because to the other country, so if you're in Canada, the United States is a foreign nation. So if you need access to U.S. citizen data, just make those arrangements to let Canada have access to it. Or the UK, for example. It's one of the deeper secrets. I will tell you that right here. I'm saying it from the podium, that this is one way they've gotten around some of the internal restrictions in terms of citizen, the rules that protect citizens in data privacy. So what future do you want to keep? Every time I come before an audience like you and others around the world, I just came back from Denmark, I've been in Germany, many others, scheduled panels, speaking opportunities. It's clear that people are troubled and are increasingly concerned. See, for 12 years, there was no conversation, discussion, or debate about this. It was assumed that somehow, because of 9/11, that we just by default, although it's done in secret, we just let the government do their thing, just to keep us safe, make us feel safe again, make sure that 9/11 never happened again. But what have we lost? I think people are now realizing that maybe we are in the process of having responded in the way we did, or finding out things about our government that are actually very uncomfortable to consider. The question is, what do we do about it? But the bigger question is, what future do we want to keep? Because I keep telling people, they tell me, what do you want to do? I say, you've got to take action. Democracy is not a spectator sport. This is not something where you sit in the stands and you watch stuff happen. Because if you do, that's all you're going to see, this stuff happening. And you get to go home, and so I'm being cynical when I say this, if bread and circuses are sufficient to keep you happy and secure and the illusion of safety, and let everything else go by, history's not kind. See, for me, having lived in Europe, having monitored this journey for any number of years with headphones, listening in on state level of military communications, I'm well aware of the dark side of history. Because I'm reminded of the 1930s, and I've spoken with people that grew up in the 1930s in Germany. It really, really frightens me when I see Enabling Act legislation being used as the excuse that somehow protecting the state takes priority, has primacy over any other rule of law or individual sovereignty. And you have this catch-22, for those who've read the novel by Joseph Heller. If you haven't, you might want to read it again. Or if you really want some bedtime reading, read The Devil's Advocate by Taylor Caldwell, written during the communist period, 1952. That's a really scary novel. Scary meaning what is possible with power. And what do we turn into? Because the last time I checked, we have fought long and hard that citizens would have rights. We're now, as I was confronted with, citizens who have rights, turning into what? Objects of a surveillance state with privileges granted by the state. As long as I have a breath in my body, I will resist that with everything I am. And so, in my final words before our break, that's why I've dedicated the rest of my life to defending life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because it matters not just for me, but every one of you in this room and beyond.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Tom. I think you've exemplified for us the kinds of things we in this faculty and many other places aspire to be open, to be passionate, to care about our society, and to do that on the values of openness of information, critique to authority, to power, and to secrecy. Before we take a short break and come back for question and answer, just a couple things I want to mention. I want to thank those who have made this, your visit, possible. First of all, the Faculty of Information and our Dean who put me up to this. The New Transparency Project, Surveillance and Social Sorting, a SHIRK project, a 7-year collaboration. The Identity, Privacy, and Security Institute here at the University of Toronto, and the the Cybersecurity Institute, and I forget the name fully, of at Ryerson University that Avner Levin sets up. So apologies for mangling that name. I also want to say briefly to the remote audience, we've been getting reports through the last hour or so that people, at least in the federal government, have had their broadcasts blocked for some reason. They can't get the signal. We've had people watching from Mexico, from Montreal, from other places in Ottawa. Here in Toronto, we've had about 20, 25 people online, but our colleagues in the federal government have, at least some, have not been able to watch that. So I'm sorry about that, but we will be putting this up on the web very shortly, and so I think this very important talk will be available, accessible freely to everyone who wishes to see it. So again, thank you very much, and we'll come back in 5 minutes, and Tom will be very happy to entertain questions, and we have until 3 o'clock in this room. So thank you very much again.